Slab Audio on music production and audio engineering. Welcome to Doc Slab Audio and our Insights series. I do believe this is the 7th video in our new series, and in this video we want to talk about understanding quality issues when dealing with sample rates and bit depths. So first and foremost, I try to tell you that to work in as high a sample rate and as high a bit depth as possible to help when you're processing and editing and recording, and when you format, to help retain as much quality as possible. So with that being said, that the issue here, whether you're dealing with sample rate, bit depth, or something like kbps or something like that with MP3s, that it's very hard to visualize sometimes, and very hard to tell somebody, you know, the complexities that's actually happening and how huge of amount of information you're dealing with, how huge audio files usually are, and the amount of information, how complex the audio is and what's going on there, even though it's just a couple numbers rolling by really fast that work out to explaining to the system that it's a type of waveform at different levels, at different speeds, that should sound a certain way. So with that understanding, that when we start getting into it, really simple, when we look in a DAW, you know, we can only see so much. I can't see an MP3 in there. When I go to look at information and I say, okay, I want to look at the size, I've got an MP3, 44.1 kilohertz, 128 kbps. It's 3 or 4 megabytes. It's a 4-minute song. 44.1 kilohertz, 24-bit wave is 62 megabytes. That is a huge difference. And you can get to CD, and that there is less than CD, is more than CD quality, right? And you get into something like 96 kilohertz, 32-bit, it's 181 megabytes. And you get to like 192 kilohertz, 64-bit, it's 724 megabytes. The difference in size is huge. That means it's just losing a lot of information. So, and when you go look at it like in something like a DAW, that you've got, like, you can look at, it's digital information, but this is 192 kilohertz, 64-bit, between 6 and 6.001 seconds. And you can see, you know, that it's pretty close to analog. I mean, it's pretty dang close. When we get to 96 kilohertz, 32-bit, you immediately see the difference in the same time frame. It's monumental. And when you get down to like 44.1 kilohertz, 24-bit, bigger than a CD, you see it. I mean, it's unbelievable, the difference, right? And you get down to 44.1 kilohertz, 16-bit, that is CD quality, that you haven't lost the sample rate, but you've lost bit depth. And it's pretty obvious, switching back and forth, that it's causing differences, right? So that means it's changing the audio. And if I were to show you an MP3 on here, you'd probably go, what? Because it's bad, bro. So the issue here is that, first of all, we can get into something like MATLAB, you know, and MATLAB, you know, there's a lot of ways that we can look at it here to try to see it. We can take files and put them in here and see them as variables. The problem is the amount of information there is unbelievable. If I scroll through this and go through all this, There is so many samples. It is very difficult to try to visualize what is actually going on, right? Now you can take sections of that in something like MATLAB, and do plots. All you can analyze in all kinds of different ways. It's very difficult sometimes to do that, and also you can do it in other ways. There are really cool, tools in something like MATLAB, like signal analyzers, that you can get in here and see the time and the spectrum to really fine detail. But without understanding what you're looking at, it's very hard to understand the scope of it. So when you get into something even like, I have like an analysis processing synthesis model that I built that has all kinds of tools, including things like time scopes and things like, spectrum analyzers that have unbelievable amounts of information about what's going on those files. That's way more than a DAW is ever going to give you. But understanding the information is very difficult, especially working in the music industry. So we even get into something like, let's say I get into something like, here is O1 Editor. Now this is for editing files. So this is actually taking this information and I'm looking at it in a hex view, right? This is hex information. This is the actual format that you see here, and you can actually dig into it. This is the MP3. This is the 44.1 at 24-bit. This is the 96 kilohertz at 32-bit, and 192 kilohertz at 64-bit. And you can actually get in here and look at the actual, hex information, and you can actually look at the formats. This is the actual format and what all the information, how it's stored, what kind of structures, all the way down to the data structure, that's the samples themselves and the word length and all that. And you can compare them in here. The problem here is, until you really get into it, it's pretty complicated, bro. I mean, it's not like you're going to go, oh, wow, so that's the difference, and then it's just that value there, and it's like, it's really complicated. It's a lot. It's so much information. Like even this MP3, I just start scrolling through it, and it's only 3 megabytes. Is in comparison to 724 megabytes. I can scroll here all day long, bro. Scroll. Does that make sense? I mean, I just go all day long, and it's a little confusing because you're just like, what? How is that? That's the size of an audio file, and this is just the smallest one. I mean, this is a little teeny MP3. It's unbelievable the amount of information in there, and how they structure it when they go into here and they start creating structs for it that is the actual format. It's unbelievable. When you get into WAV files, the structure to me is a little more well defined, but it's still, I mean, there is so much information here about what's going on with this WAV file, how it's put together, that it is unbelievable. I mean, it is just tons of information that for you to dig around in and understand what's going on there, which is cool. But I mean, it's not like you're just going to open up and go, oh yeah, well, that's the deal. It's just, what? It doesn't work like that. So basically, we get to a point to where we really have to understand the complexity and how much information we're dealing with, so that when we get into something like dealing with, we go, okay, so if we look at this and we go, let's look at this a little bit different way and see, well, we've got, let's see if I can find, I'm trying to find a window here, if you bear with me just a minute, if we can get this and look at it to where it is, we're dealing with things like visualizing this. So if you Google visualizing this, it is I mean, you're very much going to, unless you really understand digital data and these concepts, it's going to be very difficult. Audio file sizes, we talked about that, bit rates and sample depths. You got sample rate and bit depth that helps retain quality and a more true picture of what's going on. And when you get into conversion of it, you have this conversion problem that when it starts out as analog, it goes to digital. So stuff gets lost. It gets, things get messed up. And when you convert it back, the same thing happens with interpolation, which means that it's going to take these samples and try to make it sound more as analog as possible by interpolating between the samples so that it's just not ding, 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 that it's more of a smooth interpolation between things. How well it does that is questionable. So the concept here is that whenever you're looking at this, you really have to go back and go, okay, the file size is very difficult to visualize, but understanding everything you do in processing, let's say you process at 96 kilohertz 64 32 bit, and that's 181 megabytes. Okay, now all the processing you do, all the editing, all the captures you have, everything you have going on, as you go down in size to CD or MP3 or some other streaming, it cuts out mountains of information. You're dealing with 181 megabytes. That's a pretty good representation of your captures, your performances, your processing, your editing, your mixing, everything. It's broken down to 3.8 megabytes. I mean, that is ridiculous, right? And you listen to the difference. You listen to MP3s and streaming stuff all the time, right? So you have to understand that sometimes when you're dealing with all the quality issues, it's overkill and redundant for what actually gets distributed and what can you actually hear, right? I mean, if you've got $1 million home stereo and you put your M33 on it in comparison to this, you're going to hear the difference, bro. But, on your computer monitors, in your car, in your cheap home stereo, it's not real likely that the difference is so dramatic that it's like, God, I'm not even listening to that song. Just because their algorithms are pretty good. And we get into things like I talked about mastering, why we do a lot of things we do and spend a lot of time there to try to make it sound as close to that as possible. Does that make sense? Because this is a ridiculously cheap photocopy of this. Does that make sense? All that detail and everything you did is like 724 or 181 megabytes of Rembrandt, bro. And it's a cheap photocopy. Half the megabytes or more, or down to like 4 megabytes, And then that photocopy's done. It's unbelievable, right? So, but you have to also understand that you still hear a lot of quality there. And so you really have to think about that whenever you're doing anything with engineering, what actually happens there and what actually you can actually hear. Spend some time dragging some stuff into your DAW. Your audio player will probably play the differences, play an MP3 in a WAV file, and really spend some time listening in your studio monitors, and listening what differences you can actually hear. It's a huge study that you should really get into because it's really going to help you so that when you start capturing and processing and editing and mixing, that you got a lot better understanding of what is actually going to get distributed. Does that make sense? And what actually you can actually hear. Does that make sense? Because if I pull up this WAV file and I go, okay, you really think you can hear the difference between this one here and this one? The chances are you might hear some light differences, but it's a huge step. That is 192 kilohertz and 64-bit word length, 96 kilohertz sample rate and 32-bit word length. There is a huge difference there, but can you hear it? Does that make sense? Now, granted, you're going to hear the difference between here and here, there's no doubt. And then you get down to CD quality, it's even worse. You're losing bit depth. The sample rate's the same, but it causes problems. So a lot of time when you're formatting, the algorithms themselves are designed to lessen the impact of that, but it still doesn't lessen it that much. And when you start mastering, it's an art form to really try to make that cheap photocopy look as good and sound as good as that original Rembrandt because of the amount of information that is lost. It is unbelievable how much. And so I kind of want to make a video about that to get you thinking about it, get you studying about it, get you listening and trying to attune yourself to that, so that when you're working and you're formatting and you're processing, editing and capturing and mixing and everything you do, that it's kind of in your head, the reality of what's going on there, and actually what you can hear, what's happening, and that when you start getting into, you know, mastering, or when you're finishing up a mix, that, you know, what all are you is gonna get distributed, you know? I mean, you're gonna have 4 megabytes of this. You are an audiophile and you're a really good engineer and you work at 192 kilohertz 64-bit, because you're a pretty good engineer and you know what you're doing, and it's worth working in that. It's going to go down to 4 megabytes. I mean, how much is that? That's like, you know what I'm saying? How much of that is lost? It's gone. Every bit of all the stuff you did, it's gone. Not only is it gone, but it replaces information. So try to understand this. Not only is it gone, but it fills in the gaps with other crap that isn't that. So it starts trying to reinterpolate things and lay out all this information as something you can cram into this size that is not a true representation of what you did. Does that make sense? It's trying to make it something that's formatable into that size and trick you into thinking that all that information's in there. I mean, you work on this mix that's like this sound, it's just been, you know, every detail you've got into it. And then you squish it in the trash compactor into this, or, you know, this, and, you know, I mean, that's more than half the information even there. Does that make sense? And you go down to a CD quality, it's even worse, right? So it's something you really want to take into consideration and understand. It's really a lot about you being able to discern the difference with your ears and understand that, and understand when you're working what is going on there, so that you really take that into consideration whenever you're working in a music production, so that it's in your head and you understand what's happening there, you understand the differences, you understand what's happening there when that happens. You know, when they formatted MP3 or streaming stuff, it truncates tons of information, it revalues things, it tries to dither things together, it tries to trick the listener with different types of formatting algorithms that make you think that there's other stuff going on, there's more information there. It does all kinds of stuff that, you know, is detrimental to the audio, you know. So I mean, you have to understand it does a pretty good job. You listen to some streaming things and it's like, it doesn't sound that bad, right? You know, so it's just something I wanted to throw out there to get you thinking about and to point out, so that when you're dealing with the quality, that, you know, you don't get lost in that, because you know that you can put out an MP3, and with that sample rate, bit depth, the way that format's laid out, it comes out sounding pretty good. I can throw it in my home stereo and it sounds pretty good to me, bro. I mean, it's, I'm an audiophile, so I'd rather have it like this because I can hear the differences. But a lot of times it also has to do with the complexity of your music. So the more complex your music is, and the more subtle thing is, and the better of performers you're dealing with, and better of engineer you're dealing with, the more apparent it's going to be when that stuff starts happening. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this next video in our new series, and I will see you in the next video.